According to the Constitution, the President of the Republic of South Africa has the right and the privilege to appoint and dismiss anyone in his cabinet. Meanwhile, constitutional expert Pierre De Vos said every exercise of public power can be reviewed by a court on the basis of irrationality. For a court to know whether a decision is irrational, they need to know the reasons as to why the decision was made. Joining us from our parliamentary studios is Lawson Naidoo. He is the Executive Secretary of the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution. Lawson, great to have you. Thank you so much for being with us here on Morning Live.
Good morning, Leanne. Thank you very much for having me on.
Right, so given the powers that I just mentioned in the introduction that are bestowed on our president, does he really have to give reasons if he wants to reshuffle a cabinet?
Well, ordinarily not, but we know now from a court case that took place earlier this year where the Democratic Alliance challenged the president's sacking, in particular of the Minister and Deputy Minister of Finance earlier this year. And the High Court ruled that the president needed to provide not just the reasons for his decision, but also the record of the decision, which means all of the information that the president relied upon in order to reach that decision. The president has now appealed that decision, so he did not provide those reasons as yet. But so on the basis of existing law, there is an onus on the president to provide those reasons, to act rationally and within the ambit of the law. I think the key issue here is that the president's power to appoint and dismiss members of the cabinet is something that is derived directly from the Constitution and is not, as is, I think, perhaps confusingly referred to as a prerogative that has no boundaries or ambit. So it is a power that is constrained by the Constitution itself.
Yeah, I suppose one has to then ask the question, where does this leave accountability? I mean, we've seen some severe repercussions to many things in the economy, in the country, destabilizing it after some of these cabinet reshuffles. So, you know, where does the accountability lie in all of this?
Well, you know, the accountability lies directly with Parliament. Parliament, as the elected representatives of us as the citizens of South Africa, has the constitutional responsibility to hold the president and government to account. And they should be asking these questions. We've had 11 reshuffles in the Zuma administration in just over 8 years. That, as you rightly point out, creates significant levels of instability, policy confusion, and failure of service delivery, because ministers are not in their positions long enough to be able to put in place proper implementation strategies. Allied with the churn of ministers and deputy ministers, we've also seen a significant churn in senior civil servants, in directors general of government departments. All of this has led to instability in government, and Parliament should be playing its role in terms of holding the president and executive to account and telling the president that we need stability and there needs to be a proper plan.
Yeah. So what I'm gathering, and from my understanding of everything, so that South Africans know, what these cabinet reshuffles are, they are neither illegal nor unconstitutional. So it's almost like we shouldn't be having a discussion about this. He can have the prerogative to do what he wants. However, should the Constitution be under discussion?
Well, I think, you know, there have been issues raised in the last few days once again as to whether the president should have this untrammeled power or almost untrammeled power to appoint and fire ministers, and whether there should be a process of whereby, similar to the US, where there is a parliamentary confirmation process where the president nominates candidates who then go through a process in Parliament before they are finally appointed. I think the real issue here is the failure of accountability within our system of governance. It's Parliament failing to hold the president to account. And obviously the redress for that ultimately lies in the hands of the people of South Africa, in whose hands ultimate power resides. And the people of South Africa have demonstrated that by increasing levels of civic activism and active citizenry, but also, you know, to demonstrate their views on these matters at election time through the ballot box. Government has put in place what it called a performance monitoring system system for cabinet ministers and said that they will be held to performance contracts. Now, it's quite obvious that none of these reshuffles have been based on the fact of ministers failing to perform. Even though we don't know the content of those contracts, it's quite clear that when ministers such as Batabile Dlamini, who is flouting a constitutional court judgment, refused to come to Parliament this week, is not held accountable, and yet other ministers who are perhaps more focused on doing their jobs get fired, then one has to begin to ask these questions.
Yeah, we've been here before. This is not the first time that it's happened, where the DA actually took President Jacob Zuma to court, and the court then asked him to supply records for his decision. Whatever came of that?
Well, as I said earlier, that matter is now on appeal. So the court initially treated the issue as a matter of urgency, and actually the order of the court was that the president should provide the record of the decision and the reasons within 5 days. The president, as is often his legal strategy, took the matter on appeal. So the implementation of that decision is suspended until such time as that appeal is heard. And as far as I'm aware, no date has yet been set for that appeal.
Yeah. So in the case of the DA, Judge Valley ruled basically that records for the cabinet shuffle in the Pravin Gordhan case be provided to decide on what basis are the reasons irrational. So taking it forward, law expert Pierre De Vos said that after there is evidence of corruption or bad faith in his decision-making, that's what he went on to say. But how do we prove that this decision was made in bad faith?
Well, I think what the DA case was aiming at was to try and get the president to reveal the so-called intelligence report that he relied upon in order to justify the firing of Minister Gordhan at that time. And we know that there's been serious doubts cast on the validity or credibility of that intelligence report. It certainly did not appear to have emerged from the state intelligence agencies. It seems to have appeared from some other source. So if the president does in fact provide such a record to the court, and the court can be persuaded that the report is bogus, then the basis of his decision would not be rational, would not be illegal, and is liable to then be set aside by the courts.
Yeah. Just finally, as we close up this conversation, when we look at these cabinet reshuffles, are they doing any good for South Africa and the respective portfolios? Because at the end of the day, one would think that would be at the top of mind for our president when he makes these decisions. And yet it appears that it is not for the betterment of South Africa that these reshuffles are taking place.
Absolutely, and I think, again, if we go back and look at the Constitution, Leanne, we see that the Constitution places an onus on the president to act in the best interests of the country. These responsibilities of the president were spelt out very clearly by the Constitutional Court in the Nkandla case as to what the president ought to do, how he ought to conduct himself in furtherance of the national interest rather than his own personal interests. We know from the allegations in the state of capture report of the former public protector that the president may have been influenced to make cabinet appointments to suit certain private and nefarious interests. So it's in the absence of a full inquiry to explore that, there are suspicions that the president is not acting in the interests of the country, and that that is something that I think Parliament needs to hold him to account for, and his own political party needs to take responsibility for that.
All right, we leave it there for this morning. Thank you so much for coming in and interpreting this for us and giving us a good explanation about it all. Talking to Lawson Naidoo, he's the Executive Secretary of the Council for Advancement of the South African Constitution. He basically gave us a perspective with regards to the powers of the President in appointing and dismissing members of Cabinet.